The sun bled crimson across the Montana prairies, painting the endless sea of grass in hues of fire and shadow. A low wind hissed through the blades, carrying the scent of earth and impending rain. In the heart of this vastness stood a lone buffalo, his massive frame a silhouette against the dying light. His name was Coda, a name whispered by the winds that knew his story, a story of loss, resilience, and a heart too vast for his hulking form. His dark eyes, deep as the rivers that carved these lands, glinted with something beyond instinct, a fierce, unspoken vow. Coda's hooves sank into the soft earth as he lowered his head, his breath a heavy plume in the cooling air. Before him lay a calf, barely a season old, its small body trembling in the grass. Blood matted its flank, a cruel gash left by the strike of a rattlesnake, a rare but deadly predator in these plains. The calf's shallow breaths were a fragile thread, and Coda's massive head hovered over it, his warm breath stirring its fur. This was not his calf, not by blood. It belonged to a cow he'd once run beside, a member of a herd long scattered by fire and human hands. Yet Coda stood guard, his bulk a shield against the world, his heart tethered to the small life fading before him. The snake was gone, its venom spent, but the danger was far from over. The calf's mother had fled in panic, driven by the chaos of survival, leaving her young to Coda's care. He could have walked away. Instinct demanded it. A lone bull, scarred and weathered, had no place risking his life for a calf not his own. But Coda was no ordinary buffalo. His scars told of battles won and lost, of a herd burned away by wildfire, of a life spent defying the call to simply survive. He chose to stay, his hooves rooted as firmly as the ancient cottonwoods lining the distant river. The air thickened with the promise of a storm. Thunder rumbled low, a warning that the skies would soon unleash their fury. Coda's ears twitched, catching the distant howl of coyotes, drawn by the scent of blood. His massive shoulders tensed, muscles rippling beneath his shaggy coat. The calf whimpered, its small body curling tighter, and Coda's heart ached, a pain that felt almost human, a grief for something fragile and fleeting. He nudged the calf gently, urging it to rise, but it only shuddered, too weak to stand. In the distance, a flicker of movement caught Coda's eye. A human figure emerged from the tall grass, clad in worn denim and a battered hat. This was Ellie, a young rancher's daughter, no more than 16, her face etched with the hardness of a life spent wrestling with the land. She carried a rifle, her steps cautious but determined, her eyes scanning the plains for the coyotes she'd heard. Ellie's family had lost half their cattle to predators and drought, and she'd learned to trust only what she could see and shoot. Yet as her gaze fell on Coda and the calf, something shifted. The buffalo's stillness, his unwavering stance over the dying calf, struck her like a chord. She lowered her rifle, her breath catching. "Who are you protecting, big guy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She'd seen buffalo before, wild, untamed, dangerous in their power, but this one was different. His eyes held a story she couldn't yet read, a depth that made her feel small and exposed. Coda's head turned slightly, acknowledging her presence, but he didn't move. The coyotes' howls grew closer, their shadows darting through the grass. Ellie's grip tightened on her rifle, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and awe. She'd come to hunt, to protect what little her family had left, but now she faced a choice. Walk away and let nature take its course, or step into a story she didn't fully understand. The calf let out a weak bleat, and Coda's low bellow answered, a sound that vibrated through the earth, both a warning and a plea. Ellie took a step closer, her boots sinking into the mud. She saw the gash on the calf's flank, the telltale mark of a rattlesnake's bite. Her father had taught her about venom, about the slim chances of survival without anti-venom. But anti-venom was miles away, locked in a vet's clinic in town, and the storm was closing in. She glanced at Coda, his massive form unyielding, and felt a pang of something unfamiliar, respect, perhaps, or a kinship she couldn't name. The first raindrops fell, cold and heavy, as the coyote's eyes gleamed in the dusk. Coda stamped a hoof, his breath flaring, ready to face whatever came. Ellie's mind raced. She could shoot the coyotes, but that wouldn't save the calf. She could leave, but the image of Coda standing alone against the storm and the predators burned into her. She thought of her own losses, her mother, taken by illness, her brother, who'd left for the city and never looked back. She knew what it was to stand alone, to protect what mattered, even when hope seemed thin. A crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating Koda's form, his fur slick with rain, his eyes locked on the calf. Ellie made her choice. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and knelt beside the calf, her hands trembling as she checked its wound. "Hang on, little one," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the calf or herself. Koda watched her, his gaze steady, as if he understood her intent. The coyotes were closing in, their yips sharp and hungry, and the storm's roar grew louder. Koda lowered his head, his horns glinting in the lightning's flash, ready to charge. Ellie's heart hammered as she realized the weight of the moment. She was no longer just a rancher's daughter, and Koda was no mere beast. They were bound by something greater, a shared defiance against the odds. But the coyotes were near, the calf was fading, and the storm was upon them. Time was running out. What would you do to protect something fragile, something not your own? Share this story if it moved you, and join us to explore more tales of courage and connection in the wild. The rain came down in sheets, a relentless curtain that turned the Montana prairies into a blur of gray and green. Thunder shook the earth, each rumble echoing in Koda's chest as he stood over the wounded calf, his massive body a bulwark against the storm. The coyotes' eyes glinted through the downpour, their forms low and circling, emboldened by the scent of blood and the chaos of the tempest. Koda's hooves churned the mud, his bellow a deep, resonant challenge that cut through the wind. He would not yield, not to the predators, not to the storm, not to the weight of his own weariness. Ellie knelt beside the calf, her hands slick with rain and blood as she pressed a torn strip of her shirt against its wound. The rattlesnake's venom was working fast, the calf's breathing was shallow, its small body trembling beneath her touch. She cursed under her breath, her mind racing. The nearest town was a 2-hour ride, and her horse was tethered a mile back, spooked by the storm's approach. Anti-venom was a distant hope, but she couldn't shake the image of Koda's unwavering stance, his dark eyes fixed on the calf as if willing it to live. She didn't know why this buffalo's resolve stirred her so deeply, but it did. It felt like a mirror to her own stubborn refusal to give up, even when the world seemed to conspire against her. "Stay with me," she whispered to the calf, her voice swallowed by the storm. She glanced at Koda, his massive frame silhouetted against a flash of lightning. His scars were more visible now, crisscrossing his hide like a map of battles fought and survived. One ran deep across his shoulder, a jagged reminder of a brush with a hunter's bullet years ago. Another marred his flank, a relic of a clash with a rival bull. Yet here he was, standing for a calf that wasn't his, defying every instinct that should have driven him to flee. Ellie's throat tightened. She'd seen animals fight for survival, but this was something else. This was a choice. The coyotes grew bolder, their yips sharpening as they tightened their circle. There were 5 of them, lean and desperate, their hunger outweighing their fear of Koda's bulk. One darted forward, testing him, its teeth bared. Koda swung his head, his horns slicing through the air, and the coyote yelped, retreating into the rain. But they wouldn't stop. Ellie knew their kind, relentless when they sensed weakness. She fumbled for her rifle, her fingers numb from the cold, but the weight of it felt wrong. Shooting would scatter them for a moment, but it wouldn't save the calf, and it might provoke Koda into charging her instead. She needed a plan, something beyond instinct. Her eyes darted to the landscape, searching for anything that could help. The prairies stretched endlessly, but to the east, a cluster of cottonwoods loomed, their gnarled branches offering potential shelter. If she could move the calf there, she might buy time to stabilize it, maybe even find a way to signal for help. But moving a wounded animal in this storm, with coyotes circling and a buffalo on edge, was a gamble that could end in blood. Koda's bellow pulled her back to the moment. He stamped the ground, his massive head lowered, facing the coyotes as they spread out, trying to flank him. Ellie's heart pounded. She'd heard stories of buffalo taking down entire packs, but Koda was alone, and the calf's life hung in the balance. She made a snap decision. "Hey, big guy," she called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We need to move. You with me?" Koda's ears flicked toward her. his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Ellie slid her arms under the calf, grunting under its weight. It was heavier than she'd expected, but adrenaline surged through her, giving her strength. The calf whimpered, its head lolling, and Koda's eyes locked on her, wary but not hostile. He took a step closer, his bulk looming, and for a moment, Ellie thought he might charge. But he didn't. Instead, he turned, positioning himself between her and the coyotes, his massive form a living wall. The rain stung her face as she staggered toward the cottonwoods, the calf cradled in her arms. Koda moved with her, his steps deliberate, his head swinging to keep the coyotes at bay. One lunged, snapping at his flank, and Koda spun with a speed that belied his size, his horns grazing the predator's side. It yelped and fell back, but another took its place, testing his other side. Ellie's breath hitched. She'd never seen anything like this, a buffalo not just fighting, but strategizing, protecting her and the calf as if they were his own. The cottonwoods were closer now, their branches swaying wildly in the wind. Ellie's arms burned, her boots slipping in the mud, but she pushed forward, driven by the same stubborn fire she saw in Koda's eyes. She thought of her father, alone back at the ranch, his hands calloused from years of fighting to keep their land. She thought of the arguments they'd had, her insistence that she could handle the prairie on her own, his warnings that it would break her. Maybe it would. But not today. A sharp crack split the air, not thunder, but something human. A gunshot. Ellie froze, her heart lurching. Koda's head snapped up, his body tensing. In the distance, through the rain, another figure emerged. A man, older, clad in a slicker, his rifle raised. It was Tom, a grizzled rancher from the neighboring spread, known for his quick trigger and distrust of anything wild. Ellie's stomach dropped. She'd heard him talk about buffalo like they were pests, a threat to his cattle. And now here was Koda, a massive target in the storm, standing over a calf that wasn't his. "Ellie!" Tom shouted, his voice rough over the wind. "Get back. That beast'll kill you." "He's not a beast," she yelled, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. "He's protecting this calf." Tom lowered his rifle slightly, squinting through the rain. The coyotes hesitated, their ears pricked at the new threat. Koda stood his ground, his breath heavy, his eyes darting between Tom and the predators. Ellie could feel the tension, a fragile balance ready to snap. If Tom shot, if Koda charged, if the coyotes attacked, it could all end in seconds. She tightened her grip on the calf, its warmth fading against her chest. The cottonwoods were just yards away, but the storm was worsening, the coyotes were circling, and Tom's rifle was still raised. Koda let out a low, rumbling bellow, not of aggression but of warning, as if he understood the stakes. Ellie's mind raced. She had to make a choice, trust Koda and keep moving, or try to reason with Tom before blood was spilled. The calf's breathing faltered, a faint shudder against her arms. Time was running out. Can one act of courage change the course of a storm? Share this story if it stirred your heart, and stay tuned for what comes next in the wild heart of the plains. The storm roared, a beast of its own, tearing at the Montana prairies with claws of wind and rain. Lightning split the sky, casting jagged shadows over Koda, the massive buffalo whose bulk shielded the wounded calf cradled in Ellie's arms. His dark eyes burned with a quiet fury, locked on the coyotes that prowled the edges of the downpour. Their yips were sharp, hungry, but wary. Koda's presence was a force they couldn't ignore. Yet the greater threat now stood before him. Tom, the neighboring rancher, his rifle half-raised, his face a mask of suspicion and fear. Ellie's heart pounded as she staggered toward the cottonwoods, the calf's weight dragging at her strength. Its breathing was faint, a fragile rhythm against the storm's chaos. The rattlesnake's venom was relentless, and every second felt like a theft from the calf's fading life. She glanced at Koda, his massive head lowered, horns gleaming wetly in the lightning's flash. He hadn't charged Tom, hadn't fled from the coyotes. He stood, resolute, as if he understood the delicate balance of this moment. A balance Ellie was struggling to hold. "Tom, put the gun down," she shouted, her voice cracking against the wind. "He's not hurting anyone." Tom's eyes narrowed, rain streaming down his weathered face. That's a wild animal, Ellie. You're gonna get yourself killed. His finger hovered near the trigger, his gaze flicking between Coda and the coyotes. One of the predators darted forward, testing Coda's flank, and he swung his head with a guttural bellow, forcing it back. The others hesitated, their eyes glowing in the dusk, but they weren't retreating. Hunger drove them, and Coda was only one against many. Ellie's boots slipped in the mud, nearly sending her to her knees. She tightened her grip on the calf, its small body limp but still warm. The cottonwoods loomed just ahead, their branches thrashing like living things, promising shelter if she could reach them. But Tom's rifle was a ticking clock, and the Secreto Coda's defiance was pushing him to the edge. She had to act fast. "Tom, listen to me," she yelled, stepping closer to the trees, the calf heavy in her arms. "This buffalo's protecting this calf. He's not a threat to us." "Protecting?" Tom scoffed, his voice rough but uncertain. He took a step forward, his rifle still raised. "It's a damn beast, Ellie. Step away before it turns on you." Coda's ears twitched, his massive frame tensing as Tom approached. Ellie's stomach twisted. She could see the calculation in Coda's eyes, not fear, not rage, but a kind of measured resolve. He shifted his body, placing himself between the calf and Tom, his hooves sinking deep into the mud. The message was clear, he would not let harm come to the calf, no matter the cost. Ellie's mind raced. She needed to bridge the gap between Tom's fear and Coda's loyalty. She thought of her father's stories about the old days, when ranchers and buffalo clashed over land and survival. Tom carried that history in his bones, a legacy of distrust. But she saw something else in Coda, a choice to protect, to stand against instinct. She had to make Tom see it too. "Tom, look at him," she cried, her voice raw with desperation. "He's not attacking us. He's standing his ground for this calf. You ever see an animal do that?" Tom hesitated, his rifle dipping slightly. The storm raged on, rain blurring the world, but Ellie saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. She pressed her advantage, stepping closer to the cottonwoods, her arms burning under the calf's weight. "Help me get this calf to shelter. We can save it. You don't have to trust him. Just trust me." The coyotes yipped again, closer now, their forms weaving through the grass. Coda snorted, his head swinging toward them, his horns a silent threat. Ellie's heart sank. If Coda fought the coyotes, Tom might shoot. If he didn't, the predators would close in. She needed time, but the storm and the calf's fading life weren't giving her any. A sudden movement caught her eye, a small, dark shape darting through the rain. Not a coyote, but a bird, a raven, its wings beating furiously against the wind. It landed on Coda's back, unafraid, and let out a harsh cry. Ellie blinked, stunned. The raven's presence felt like a sign, a strange alliance in this wild chaos. Coda didn't flinch, as if he knew the bird, as if they shared some unspoken bond. The raven cawed again, its head tilted toward the coyotes, and Coda stamped his hoof, his bellow shaking the air. Tom froze, his rifle lowering another inch. "What the hell?" he muttered, staring at the raven. The bird's boldness, perched on a buffalo in the middle of a storm, seemed to crack something in his resolve. Ellie seized the moment. "Tom, help me carry this calf. We're almost at the trees. Please." Her voice broke, not from fear but from the weight of what she was asking. For Tom to see beyond his instincts, just as Coda had. Tom's jaw tightened, but he slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped forward. "You're crazy, kid," he growled, but his tone softened. He reached for the calf, his rough hands brushing against Ellie's as he took half its weight. Together, they stumbled toward the cottonwoods, Coda pacing beside them, his eyes never leaving the coyotes. The raven took flight, swooping low over the predators, its cries scattering them momentarily. Under the cottonwoods, the rain was less brutal, the branches forming a partial shield. Ellie and Tom laid the calf on a bed of wet leaves, its breathing barely audible. Ellie's hands shook as she checked the wound, the gash stark against the calf's matted fur. "It's bad," she whispered, her heart sinking. "We need anti-venom, fast." Tom knelt beside her, his face grim. "Ain't no way we're getting to town in this storm. You know that." Ellie's eyes stung, not from the rain but from the truth in his words. She looked at Coda, standing just outside the trees, his massive form a sentinel in the storm. The raven had returned to his back, its feathers slick with rain. Coda's gaze met hers, and she saw something there. Grief, determination, a silent plea to keep fighting. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice fierce. "There's a ranger station 10 miles north. They might have anti-venom. If we can get there." 10 miles. Tom interrupted, his voice sharp. "In this? With coyotes and that buffalo watching us? You'll die, Ellie." Coda let out a low rumble, as if in defiance of Tom's words. The raven cawed, its cry sharp and insistent. Ellie's resolve hardened. She didn't know if she could make it, but she knew she couldn't stay here and watch the calf die. Coda's choice to stand and fight had changed something in her, awakened a fire she hadn't known she carried. "I'm going," she said, standing. "Tom, stay with the calf. Keep the coyotes off. I'll be back." Tom's eyes widened. "Ellie, you can't." But she was already moving, her boots splashing through the mud. Coda's head turned, his eyes following her, and she felt his strength like a pulse in her veins. The storm raged, the coyotes howled, and the ranger station was a distant hope. But Coda's stand had shown her what was possible when you chose to fight for something greater than yourself. What would you risk for a life that depends on you? Share this story if it sparked your courage, and join us for the next chapter of this wild journey. The storm's fury lashed the Montana prairies, turning the world into a churning sea of rain and wind. Ellie sprinted through the deluge, her boots sinking into the mud, her heart hammering with a mix of fear and resolve. The ranger station was 10 miles north, a faint hope for anti-venom to save the calf, but the path was treacherous, slick with rain, shadowed by coyotes, and haunted by the storm's relentless roar. Behind her, under the cottonwoods, Tom knelt beside the wounded calf, his rifle at the ready, while Coda, the massive buffalo, stood as a guardian against the circling predators. The raven, an unlikely ally, perched on Coda's back, its sharp cries cutting through the chaos like a beacon. Ellie's breath burned in her lungs as she ran, the cold rain stinging her face. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, warnings about the prairie's dangers, about the folly of trusting wild things. But Coda's defiance, his choice to protect a calf not his own, had shattered her doubts. She'd seen the depth in his eyes, a wisdom that felt almost human, and it drove her forward. The calf's life hung by a thread, and she would not let it break. Back at the cottonwoods, Coda's massive frame was a fortress in the storm. His dark eyes tracked the coyotes as they wove through the grass, their forms barely visible in the downpour. The pack had grown bolder, sensing the calf's weakness, but Coda's presence held them at bay. His hooves churned the mud, his head lowered, horns gleaming like curved blades. The raven cawed again, its wings fluttering as it hopped along his spine, as if urging him to stand firm. Tom watched, his hands steady on his rifle, but his heart uneasy. He'd spent decades on these plains, culling what he saw as threats, but Coda's resolve was unlike anything he'd encountered. It wasn't just strength, it was purpose. The calf whimpered, its small body shivering beneath Tom's makeshift shelter of branches. He pressed the blood-soaked cloth against its wound, his jaw tight. "Hold on, little one," he muttered, his voice softer than he'd intended. He glanced at Coda, whose scars told a story of survival against odds Tom could only imagine. For the first time, he wondered if he'd misjudged the creatures he'd spent his life keeping at bay. Miles away, Ellie stumbled through the rain, her flashlight's beam cutting a weak path through the darkness. The storm had turned the prairie into a maze of flooded gullies and tangled grass. Her horse was too far back, spooked by the thunder, and her only guide was the faint outline of a trail she'd ridden years ago. Lightning illuminated the sky, revealing a swollen creek cutting across her path. Its waters roared, churning with debris, and Ellie's heart sank. Crossing it was a risk, but turning back wasn't an option. She thought of Coda, standing unyielding against the coyotes, and of the calves' faint breaths. She thought of her own losses, her mother's death, her brother's absence, the ranch that was slipping through her father's hands. She'd felt powerless then, but now, with Koda's courage as her anchor, she refused to let despair win. She tied her jacket around her waist, gripped her flashlight, and waded into the creek. The water was icy, tugging at her legs, but she pushed forward, her teeth gritted against the cold. Back at the cottonwoods, the coyotes made their move. One lunged, teeth bared, aiming for the calf. Koda roared, his massive head swinging, and caught the predator with a glancing blow of his horn. It yelped, tumbling into the mud, but another darted in from the side, snapping at his flank. The raven took flight, diving at the coyote's eyes with a screech, giving Koda a moment to reposition. Tom fired a warning shot into the air, the crack echoing through the storm. The coyotes scattered, but only briefly, their hunger pulling them back. "Damn it," Tom growled, reloading. He looked at Koda, whose breath came in heavy plumes, his eyes fierce but weary. The buffalo's strength was immense, but he couldn't hold off the pack forever. Tom's gaze fell on the calf, its small chest rising and falling with agonizing slowness. He thought of Ellie, running through the storm, risking everything for a creature that wasn't even hers. He thought of his own son, lost to a city that promised more than the prairie ever could. Maybe Ellie was right. Maybe there was something worth fighting for here, something bigger than survival. Ellie reached the far bank of the creek, gasping, her clothes heavy with water. The ranger station was still miles off, but the trail was clearer now, winding through a stretch of low hills. She pushed on, her legs burning, her mind fixed on the image of Koda standing guard. But then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, not a coyote's yip but something deeper, more primal. Her flashlight swept the darkness, catching a pair of yellow eyes in the brush. A mountain lion, lean and desperate, drawn by the storm's chaos and the scent of struggle. Her heart stopped. She had no rifle, no defense but her wits and the knife at her belt. The lion crouched, its muscles taut, ready to spring. Ellie's mind flashed to Koda, to the way he'd faced the coyotes without flinching. She squared her shoulders, raising her flashlight like a weapon, its beam unsteady in her shaking hand. "Back off," she shouted, her voice raw but defiant. The lion hesitated, its eyes narrowing. Ellie took a step forward, her heart pounding, channeling Koda's unyielding resolve. The storm roared around her, lightning flashing, and for a moment, she felt as if Koda's strength was with her, a silent vow across the miles. But the lion's growl deepened, its body coiling for the attack. At the cottonwoods, Koda let out a bellow that shook the trees, his horns slashing as another coyote lunged. The raven swooped, its cries a frantic counterpoint to the storm. Tom fired again, this time grazing a coyote's flank, sending it howling into the dark. But the pack was relentless, and the calves' breaths were growing weaker. Time was slipping away, for Ellie, for Koda, for the calf. What does it mean to stand against the odds, to fight for something beyond yourself? Share this story if it ignited your spirit, and join us for the next chapter of this untamed saga. The Montana prairie was a battlefield of storm and shadow, the rain a relentless hammer against the earth. Ellie stood frozen, her flashlight's trembling beam locked on the mountain lion's yellow eyes, glinting like twin fires in the dark. The beast crouched low, its muscles coiled, a low growl rumbling from its throat. Her knife, clutched in her rain-slicked hand, felt pitiful against the predator's raw power. The ranger station, with its promise of anti-venom for the calf, was still miles away, and the swollen creek behind her cut off any retreat. But Ellie's mind clung to Koda's image, the buffalo's unyielding stand over the wounded calf, his scars a testament to battles fought for something greater than himself. She would not break. "Get back!" she shouted, her voice sharp against the storm's roar. She thrust the flashlight forward, its beam slicing through the rain, and stomped her boot, mimicking the defiance she'd seen in Koda. The lion flinched, its ears twitching, but it didn't retreat. Its hunger was a living thing, sharpened by the storm's chaos. Ellie's heart thundered, her breath shallow, but she held her ground, her eyes never leaving the predators. She thought of the calves' faint breaths, of Koda's bellows shaking the cottonwoods, of the raven's fearless cries. She was part of their fight now, bound by a thread of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Back at the cottonwoods, Koda faced his own war. The coyotes had regrouped, their forms darting through the rain-soaked grass, their yips a taunting chorus. The calf lay motionless beneath Tom's makeshift shelter, its small body barely rising with each labored breath. Tom's rifle was steady, but his shots were fewer now. Ammunition was low, and the coyotes knew it. Koda's massive frame was a wall between the calf and the pack, his horns slashing through the air as one coyote lunged too close. The raven, still perched on his back, screeched and dove, its beak snapping at the predator's eyes, a fleeting distraction that gave Koda a moment to breathe. Tom's hands shook as he reloaded, his eyes flicking between the calf and Koda. The buffalo's strength was staggering, but even he was tiring. Blood trickled from a shallow bite on his flank, and his breaths came in heavy, ragged bursts. Tom had seen animals fight for survival, but this was different. Koda wasn't just surviving. He was choosing to protect, to stand for a life that wasn't his. It stirred something in Tom, a memory of his son, who'd left the prairie with dreams of a better life, leaving Tom to wrestle with the land alone. He'd hardened himself against loss, against hope, but Koda's resolve cracked that armor. "Keep it up, big fella," Tom muttered, his voice rough but tinged with awe. He fired another shot, scattering the coyotes, but they returned, their eyes gleaming with relentless hunger. The calves' breathing faltered, a faint shudder that sent a pang through Tom's chest. He thought of Ellie, out there in the storm, risking everything for this small life. He thought of his own failures, the times he'd chosen safety over courage. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Miles away, Ellie's standoff with the mountain lion teetered on a knife's edge. Lightning cracked, illuminating the predator's sleek form, its claws digging into the mud. She took a step forward, her knife raised, her voice a raw shout. "I said back off." The lion snarled, but something in her defiance, the echo of Koda's unyielding spirit, made it hesitate. Then, a sound cut through the storm, a sharp, piercing cry. The raven, wings beating against the wind, swooped from the darkness, diving at the lion's face. Its beak grazed the predator's ear, and the lion roared, swiping at the air. Ellie seized the moment. She lunged forward, swinging her flashlight, its heavy base connecting with the lion's shoulder. The beast yelped, stumbling back, and the raven struck again, a black blur of fury. The lion retreated into the brush, its growl fading into the storm. Ellie's legs buckled, her breath coming in gasps, but she couldn't stop. The ranger station was closer now, its faint outline visible through the rain. She clutched her knife, her heart racing with a mix of fear and triumph. The raven circled above, its cries a strange encouragement, as if it, too, carried Koda's fight. At the cottonwoods, the coyotes pressed their attack. Two lunged at once, one aiming for Koda's flank, the other for the calf. Koda roared, his massive head swinging, catching one coyote with a brutal toss of his horns. It hit the ground hard, whimpering, but the second reached the calf, its teeth grazing the shelter. Tom fired, the shot grazing the coyote's leg, and it fled, but the pack was relentless. Koda staggered, blood dripping from his wounds, his strength waning. The raven dove again, its cries frantic, but the coyotes were too many. Tom's heart pounded. He had one shot left, maybe two. He looked at the calf, its eyes half open, its life slipping away. He looked at Koda, whose bellows were weaker now, but whose eyes still burned with purpose. Tom made a choice. He dropped his rifle and grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it at the nearest coyote. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice raw. Koda turned, his eyes meeting Tom's, and for a moment, they were allies, bound by the same desperate fight. Ellie reached the ranger station, its wooden door rattling in the wind. She pounded on it, her fists bruised, her voice hoarse. "Help! We need anti-venom." The door swung open, revealing a startled ranger, his face lit by a lantern. "Please," Ellie gasped. "There's a calf, snakebite. It's dying." The ranger's eyes widened, but he nodded, grabbing a medical kit. "Show me," he said, pulling on a raincoat. As they ran back into the storm, Ellie felt a surge of hope, fragile but fierce. She thought of Koda, of Tom, of the calves' faint breaths. But the prairie was unforgiving, and the night was far from over. The coyotes were closing in, Koda's strength was fading, and the storm showed no mercy. What does it take to hold on when the world demands you let go? Share this story if it stirred your soul, and join us for the next chapter of this wild, unbreakable journey. The Montana prairie pulsed with the storm's fading fury, the rain now a steady drumbeat rather than a torrent. Lightning flickered, weaker but still sharp, illuminating the cottonwoods where Coda stood, bloodied and resolute, his massive frame a bulwark over the wounded calf. The anti-venom had been administered, a fragile thread of hope injected into the calf's faltering body, but its breaths remained shallow, each one a quiet defiance against the rattlesnake's venom. Ellie knelt beside it, her hands steadying its trembling form, her eyes burning with a mix of exhaustion and determination. Caleb, the ranger, packed away his medical kit, his face grim but focused, while Tom stood guard over the disarmed hunter, his branch raised like a scepter of newfound purpose. The raven, perched on Coda's back, let out a low croak, its dark eyes scanning the shadows where the coyotes had retreated. Coda's breath came in heavy plumes, his wounds glistening in the lantern's light. The gash on his flank was deep, the blood mixing with rain and mud, but his eyes never wavered from the calf. He had fought coyotes, faced a hunter's rifle, and stood against the storm itself, all for a life not his own. Ellie felt a pang in her chest, a recognition of the buffalo's sacrifice that mirrored her own desperate run through the night. She thought of her father, alone at the ranch, his hands worn from years of holding on to a fading dream. She thought of Tom, who had spent decades seeing the prairie as an enemy, now risking his life for it. And she thought of Coda, whose scars told a story of loss and loyalty that transcended instinct. "We've done what we can," Caleb said, his voice low as he checked the calf's pulse. "The anti-venom's in, but it needs time. And warmth. This storm's not helping." Ellie nodded, her throat tight. She looked at Coda, whose massive head was lowered, his nose brushing the calf's flank as if urging it to hold on. The raven hopped closer, its beak nudging Coda's fur, a strange gesture of camaraderie that made Ellie's heart ache. "We need to get it somewhere dry," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the night. "The ranger station's too far, but there's an old barn a mile west. My dad used it for storage before the drought." Caleb frowned, wiping rain from his face. A mile's a long way to carry a calf in this mess. And with him around, he nodded toward the hunter, who sat sullenly in the mud. "We can't take chances." Tom's grip tightened on the branch, his eyes hard. "This one's not going anywhere," he growled, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd found something worth fighting for. The hunter glared but stayed silent, his plans shattered by Coda's defiance and Tom's unexpected resolve. Ellie stood, her legs shaky but her mind clear. "We'll carry it together. Coda will follow." She met the buffalo's gaze, seeing the same unyielding fire that had driven her through the storm. "Won't you, big guy?" Coda let out a low rumble, his hooves shifting as if in agreement. The raven cawed, its wings fluttering, and Ellie felt a surge of certainty. They were a strange alliance, human, buffalo, and bird, but they were bound by a shared purpose, a vow to see this small life through. Caleb and Ellie lifted the calf, its body limp but warmer now, the anti-venom working its slow magic. Tom kept his eyes on the hunter, who rose reluctantly, hands raised under the threat of the branch. Coda moved with them, his massive form a shield against the lingering threat of coyotes, his steps slow but deliberate. The storm had eased, but the wind still bit, and the prairie stretched dark and endless around them. The barn was a shadow on the horizon, its weathered frame barely standing, but it promised shelter. Ellie's arms burned under the calf's weight, her breath ragged, but she drew strength from Coda's steady pace. She glanced at him, his scars stark in the lantern's glow, and wondered about his past, about the herd he'd lost, the battles he'd fought, the choices that had led him to this moment. She thought of her own choices, her refusal to let the prairie break her, and felt a kinship with this creature who should have been wild and distant but was instead her ally. A sudden rustle in the grass made her tense. Caleb's hand went to his pistol, but it was only the raven, swooping low, its cry sharp. Coda's ears twitched, his head swinging toward the sound, but he didn't falter. The coyotes were gone, driven off by the gunfire and Coda's ferocity, but the prairie held other dangers, hidden gullies, lingering predators, the storm's unpredictable wrath. Ellie's heart pounded, but she pushed forward, the barn growing closer with each step. They reached it as the rain softened to a drizzle, the wind's howl fading to a whisper. The barn's door creaked as Caleb shoved it open, revealing a musty interior littered with old hay and rusted tools. They laid the calf on a bed of straw, its breathing steadier now, its eyes flickering open for the first time. Ellie's chest tightened with hope, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The anti-venom needed time, and Coda's wounds needed care. Caleb knelt beside the calf, checking its vitals. "It's got a chance," he said, his voice cautious but warm. "You did good, Ellie." She shook her head, her eyes on Coda, who stood just outside the barn, his massive frame filling the doorway. "He did." The raven perched on a rafter, its dark eyes watching, and Ellie felt a strange gratitude for its presence, as if it, too, had chosen to fight. Tom pushed the hunter inside, securing his wrists with a length of rope from the barn. "You're staying put till the sheriff gets here," he said, his voice hard but steady. The hunter muttered a curse but didn't resist. Tom's gaze softened as he looked at the calf, then at Coda. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said quietly, almost to himself. Ellie approached Coda, her hand outstretched, stopping just short of his bloodied flank. "You're hurt," she said, her voice soft. "We'll get you fixed up." Coda's eyes met hers, deep and knowing, and she felt a weight lift, replaced by a fierce resolve to see this through. But the night wasn't done with them. A low rumble echoed in the distance. Not thunder, but something heavier, like the earth itself shifting. Ellie's heart sank. The prairie was alive, and its challenges were far from over. What does it mean to carry hope through the darkest night? Share this story if it moved you, and join us for the next chapter of this untamed saga. The Montana prairie exhaled as the storm dwindled to a soft drizzle, the sky bruised with fading clouds. The old barn stood like a weary sentinel, its weathered boards creaking under the weight of the night's trials. Inside, the calf lay on a bed of straw, its breath steadier now, the anti-venom weaving its slow miracle. Ellie knelt beside it, her hands gentle on its flank, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but alight with hope. Coda, the massive buffalo, stood just outside the barn's open door, his bloodied form silhouetted against the dawn's first gray light. His wounds were deep, his strength spent, yet his dark eyes held a quiet resolve, fixed on the calf he'd fought to save. The raven, perched on a rafter, let out a soft croak, its feathers ruffled but its presence unwavering, a silent partner in their shared stand. Caleb, the ranger, worked quickly, cleaning Coda's wounds with supplies from his kit. The buffalo flinched but didn't pull away, his trust in these humans a fragile bridge built through the storm. Tom stood guard over the bound hunter, his face etched with a new kind of strength. Not the hardness of a man who'd fought the prairie, but the resolve of one who'd learned to fight for it. The distant rumble Ellie had heard moments ago lingered in her mind, a reminder that the prairie was never truly at rest. The rumble grew louder, a deep vibration that shook the barn's timbers. Ellie stood, her heart quickening. "What is that?" she whispered, stepping toward the door. Coda's ears twitched, his head lifting, and the raven took flight, circling above the barn with a sharp cry. Caleb joined her, his hand on his pistol, his eyes scanning the horizon. Through the drizzle, shapes emerged, massive, shaggy forms moving as one. A herd of buffalo, their hooves a rolling thunder, their breath steaming in the cool dawn air. Ellie's breath caught. She'd heard stories of the great herds, nearly lost to time, but seeing them now, their power and grace unbroken, was like witnessing the prairie's heartbeat. Coda let out a low bellow, not of challenge but of recognition, as if the herd's arrival answered a call he'd carried in his scars. The lead bull, a giant even larger than Coda, paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes locking with Coda's. There was no rivalry, only a silent acknowledgement, a homecoming. "They're his," Tom said, his voice soft with awe. "He must have been outcast, but they've come back for him." Ellie's eyes stung, not from the rain but from the weight of it all. Coda's solitude, his choice to protect a calf not his own, his stand against coyotes, a hunter, and the storm itself. She thought of her own losses, her mother's absence, her brother's departure, the ranch her father fought to keep. She'd felt alone, but Coda had shown her that family wasn't just blood, it was the choice to stand, to protect, to love against all odds. The calf stirred, its eyes opening fully for the first time, a soft bleat escaping its throat. Ellie knelt beside it, her hand brushing its fur, and felt a warmth spread through her chest. "You're gonna make it," she whispered, her voice breaking. Caleb smiled, checking the calf's pulse. "It's strong," he said. "You all gave it a chance." The herd's presence seemed to shift the air, a promise of renewal. The lead bull stepped closer, and Coda moved to meet him, his gait slow but steady. The raven landed on Coda's back, its cry a triumphant note. Ellie watched, her heart swelling, as the herd parted, revealing a cow whose eyes fixed on the calf. It was the mother, returned from her panicked flight, her low moan a call of recognition. She approached, nudging the calf gently, and it struggled to its feet, wobbly but alive. Coda stood back, his role as guardian complete, but his eyes held a quiet sorrow. Ellie understood, he'd given everything, but this wasn't his family to keep. Yet as the herd closed ranks around the calf and its mother, the lead bull lowered his head to Coda, a gesture of respect. Coda was no longer an outcast. He had earned his place. Tom released the hunter, who muttered a curse but slunk away, his plans undone by a buffalo's courage and a community's resolve. Caleb radioed for the sheriff, ensuring the man wouldn't escape justice. Tom turned to Ellie, his weathered face softening. "You were right, kid," he said. "About him. About all of it." Ellie nodded, her throat tight. She looked at Coda, now surrounded by the herd, his scars a testament to a life of choices that defied instinct. She thought of her father, waiting at the ranch, and knew she'd carry this night with her. A lesson in courage, in love, in the unbreakable bonds that could form between human, animal, and the wild itself. As the herd moved off, Coda lingered, his eyes meeting Ellie's one last time. The raven took flight, circling above, its cry a farewell that echoed across the plains. The calf, now steadied by its mother, followed the herd, its steps tentative but sure. Ellie felt a tear slip down her cheek, not of sadness but of something deeper, a reverence for the prairie's heart, for Coda's sacrifice, for the hope they'd all carried through the dark. Months later, the prairie bore the marks of that night. The calf grew strong, its mother never straying far. Coda's herd roamed the plains, a symbol of resilience, and stories of the lone buffalo who'd stood against a storm spread among the ranchers and rangers. Ellie and her father worked to protect the land, partnering with Caleb to advocate for the buffalo's return. Tom, once a skeptic, became their fiercest ally, his ranch a haven for the herd's stragglers. A small marker stood near the cottonwoods, a simple stone etched with a buffalo's silhouette, a tribute to Coda's stand. The raven still circled the plains, a dark guardian watching over the herd. And somewhere, in the vastness of the prairie, Coda's hoofprints remained, a reminder that love and courage know no bounds, not of species, not of time, not of the wild heart that beats in us all. What act of courage has changed your world? Share this story if it touched your soul, and let's honor the unbreakable bonds that define us. The Montana prairie stretched boundless under a sky of endless blue, its grasses swaying in a gentle breeze that carried the scent of earth and renewal. The storm that had torn through the plains months ago was now a memory, etched into the land's bones and the hearts of those who had faced it. The cottonwoods stood tall, their leaves whispering tales of that night, of Coda, the scarred buffalo whose courage had defied the wild's indifference, of Ellie, the young rancher's daughter who found her strength in his shadow, of Tom, the hardened rancher who learned to see the prairie anew, and of Caleb, the ranger whose steady hands had woven hope into despair. Above them all, the raven still circled, a dark sentinel whose cries seemed to echo the prairie's pulse. Coda's hoofprints remained, faint but indelible, pressed into the earth near the old barn where the calf had been saved. The calf, now grown strong, roamed with its mother among the herd that had returned for Coda, their massive forms a testament to the prairie's enduring spirit. The herd's presence was a quiet triumph, a reclamation of a land that had once teetered on the edge of loss. Coda, no longer an outcast, moved among them, his scars a map of battles fought and won, not for dominance, but for love, for a calf not his own, for a bond that transcended instinct. Ellie stood on the rise overlooking the prairie, her boots planted in the grass, her eyes tracing the herd's slow migration. At 16, she carried the weight of that night like a badge, her heart shaped by the choices she'd made. Her father, weathered but proud, stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Their ranch, once a fading dream, had found new life. Ellie had convinced him to dedicate a portion of their land to the buffalo, a sanctuary where Koda's herd could roam free. It wasn't just for the animals, it was for her, for the girl who'd run through a storm, who'd faced a mountain lion, who'd seen a buffalo choose hope over survival. "Never thought I'd see this," her father said, his voice soft, his eyes on the herd. "You changed things, Ellie. You and that damn buffalo." She smiled, her throat tight. "His name's Koda," she said, and her father chuckled, a sound she hadn't heard in years. The ranch was no longer just a fight against drought and debt, it was a promise, a place where the prairie's heart could beat again. Ellie had started a journal, scribbling down the story of that night, not just for herself but for others. She wanted the world to know what Koda had done, what they'd all done together. Her words, raw and honest, were finding their way to local papers, to conservation groups, to anyone who'd listen. The prairie wasn't just a place, it was a story, and she was its keeper. Tom had changed, too. The grizzled rancher, once quick to raise his rifle against anything wild, now wore a different kind of resolve. His ranch, adjacent to Ellie's, had become a haven for stragglers from Koda's herd, a place where buffalo could graze without fear of fences or bullets. He'd sold off his remaining cattle, a decision that shocked the local ranchers, and poured his energy into protecting the plains. He'd even carved a small wooden buffalo, placing it near the cottonwoods as a tribute to Koda's stand. At 60, Tom had found a purpose he hadn't known he'd lost, a reason to fight for something beyond his own survival. "Never thought I'd be a buffalo man," he'd told Ellie one day, his voice gruff but warm. "But that big fella showed me something. Made me think of my boy, how I let him go without a fight. Ain't making that mistake again." Ellie had nodded, understanding more than she could say. Tom had started visiting schools, telling kids about the night he'd stood with a buffalo against a storm. His stories, rough but heartfelt, sparked something in the children, a curiosity about the wild, a respect for the creatures that shared their land. He wasn't just a rancher anymore, he was a bridge, connecting the human world to the prairie's soul. Caleb, the ranger, had taken Koda's story to the state's conservation board. His report, detailed and passionate, led to new protections for the buffalo herds, a small but vital step toward their return. The ranger station where Ellie had pounded on the door that night now had a plaque, a simple bronze plate with a buffalo silhouette and the words, "For Koda, who showed us courage." Caleb visited Ellie's ranch often, not just for work but for the quiet moments when they'd watch the herd, their silence a shared reverence for what they'd witnessed. At 30, he was no longer just a ranger doing his job, he was a guardian of a legacy, one that Koda had carved into the earth. The hunter, apprehended that night, faced charges for illegal poaching. His trial was a small affair, but it sent ripples through the community. Ranchers who'd once turned a blind eye to such acts began to speak out, their voices bolstered by Koda's story. The prairie was no longer just a resource to be tamed, it was a living thing, worthy of respect. Ellie testified at the trial, her words steady, her eyes fierce. She spoke of Koda's scars, of the calves' survival, of the raven's fearless dives. The courtroom was silent, her story a force that no one could ignore. The raven still roamed the plains, its dark wings a familiar sight to those who knew the story. Some said it followed Koda, a guardian spirit bound to the buffalo who defied the odds. Ellie saw it often, perched on a fence post or circling above the herd, its cries a reminder of the night they'd all stood together. She'd named it Shadow, a nod to its silent loyalty, its refusal to abandon the fight. The name felt right, a piece of the prairie's magic that she couldn't explain but didn't need to. The calf, now a yearling, bore a faint scar from the rattlesnake's bite, a mark that set it apart but didn't slow it down. It ran with the herd, its mother always close, their bond a quiet echo of Koda's sacrifice. Ellie watched them sometimes, her heart swelling at the sight of the yearling's strength, its playful charges through the grass. She wondered if it remembered that night, if it carried Koda's courage in its blood. She liked to think it did. The prairie itself seemed to carry the story. The cottonwoods stood taller, their roots drinking deep from the earth. The old barn, once a crumbling relic, was now a waypoint for conservationists and locals who came to hear Ellie's tale. They'd sit in its shadow, listening as she spoke of Koda, of the storm, of the choices that had changed them all. Some left inspired, starting their own efforts to protect the land. Others left with a quiet awe, a sense that they'd glimpsed something greater than themselves. Ellie's journal grew, page after page filled with stories of the prairie, not just Coda's, but others she'd begun to collect. Tales of wolves and hawks, of ranchers and rangers, of a land that refused to be broken. She sent her words to magazines, to websites, to anyone who'd share them. The response was overwhelming: letters from children, donations to the sanctuary, calls for more protections. Coda's story had become a spark, igniting a movement that reached beyond Montana's borders. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the prairie in gold, Ellie walked to the stone marker near the cottonwoods. It was simple, just a buffalo silhouette and Coda's name, but it felt like a shrine. She knelt, her fingers tracing the etching, and thought of that night. The rain, the coyotes, the mountain lion, the raven's cries. She thought of Coda's eyes, deep and knowing, and the way they'd met hers, as if he'd seen her soul. She thought of her own journey, from a girl fighting to prove herself to a woman who'd found her purpose. Her father joined her, his steps slow but steady. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice thick. "This land's got a future because of you." Ellie shook her head, her eyes on the herd in the distance. "Because of Coda," she said. "He showed us how." Tom arrived, his truck rattling down the dirt path. He carried a small carving, another buffalo, this one for the sanctuary's gate. "Figured it's time we made this official," he said, his grin weathered but genuine. Caleb was there too, his ranger hat tipped back, his eyes on the horizon where the herd grazed. The raven circled above, its cry a soft note in the evening air. As the sun sank, casting long shadows across the prairie, Ellie felt a peace she hadn't known before. The land was alive, its heart beating in the hoofprints of Coda's herd, in the stories she told, in the bonds forged that night. The prairie had tested them, human, buffalo, and bird, and they had answered, not with force but with love, with courage, with choices that defied the wild's indifference. Coda's legacy was more than survival. It was a reminder that the heart of the plains wasn't just in the grass or the sky. It was in the acts of defiance, the refusal to let go, the willingness to stand for something greater. Ellie looked at the marker, at the herd, at the people who'd become her family. She thought of the raven, of the calf, of the night that had changed everything. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the prairie would carry their story forever. The wind whispered, the herd moved on, and Coda's hoofprints led the way, a path of courage etched into the earth. What story will you carry forward? Share this tale if it stirred your heart, and let's keep the prairie's spirit alive.